In acknowledging the seriousness of the collective church's failing and deep harm experienced by children, young people, and adults in care, we have removed the music intro as our way to sit in silence.
In this episode, we're given an opportunity to reflect on the final report from the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in Care in State and Faith-Based Institutions that was released a couple of weeks ago. And if we don't take this opportunity to change in light of what is in the report, then we are out of step with the Spirit of Jesus, who is reconciling all things back to God.
As we are reflecting on what the Commission has reported, we encourage you to take care of yourself as you are listening and reach out if you need help.
And if you do need some help, there are some resources and links that you can find at the transcript of this episode at baptist.nz. The episode will finish and we'll go into another time of silence to acknowledge again the seriousness of this topic.
If we don't change based on these recommendations, nothing changes for survivors. There is a particular power that a pastor holds, and a lot of that is because of what we as congregants kind of invest them with. We have expectations about what pastors are going to do, that they're going to act rightly in a particular situation, or there's someone that we can trust, there's someone that we can go to for help. That's a type of power.
Jaimee, welcome back again to the Change of the Head podcast. You're our first ever third-time guest, and you have a bit of a habit of jumping on in a hurry when something significant happens in our culture or in our country. So something significant has happened again, and so thank you so much for joining us to share your take and invite some reflections into a really important topic that we'll discuss today. That topic, of course, is the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in Care in both state and faith-based contexts. So thank you for sharing again on an important topic, a heavy topic, and for inviting us to think about what the changes are necessary ahead for the church in the light of this terrible failure that the church and faith-based institutions are sitting with. So thank you. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe as we begin, would you just kind of tell people, in case they just aren't familiar with what this Royal Commission has been about, what is this process and what have they been up to?
Yeah, so the Royal Commission of Inquiry began in 2018, this particular Royal Commission. It came off the back of significant advocacy and calls for this type of inquiry, particularly from survivors of abuse in state care. They spent a little bit of time determining the terms of the inquiry and decided to increase the scope to include faith-based care settings. Now, the reason for this is largely that most of the state care sector was actually in faith-based care. So they would commission faith-based institutions to perform this care on behalf of the state. So they decided to increase that scope. The time frame was also limited to 1950 to 1999. During the course of the inquiry, they did start to allow for limited scope to consider stories up until 2019. So if you do have a look at the report, there will be a few stories from people who are quite young, and you'd think they're not even born within that 1950 to 1999, but there were a few stories that the commissioners heard that happened up until 2019. Throughout the course of their inquiry, mostly what the commissioners were doing was listening. And so that was their goal. It's not a judicial inquiry, so there's no convictions or anything, no judgments. This was about hearing survivors' stories and believing those stories on face value. About 2,400 survivors told their stories to the commissioners. So there were some public hearings, there were also a lot of private hearings, and people could write in their stories. There are a number of different ways that survivors could engage. Then last Wednesday, they published a report, a full report called Whanaketia, Through Pain and Trauma from Darkness to Light. This is the main report that kind of draws together all of the findings, but there are other significant reports along the way that are worth engaging if you're wanting to engage in this space. Particularly the 2021 report around redress, I think, is really important, and there's some great recommendations there that we can be working through.
So you've been sitting now for about a week when we're recording in the report that has been released. I wonder, could you talk a little bit about the main takeaways that you are sitting with right now? And maybe as another question there, has there been anything that has surprised you as you've been reading and sitting in it?
I think, so kind of on a high level, what the Commission's uncovered is that abuse was pervasive throughout care organisations. In some ways, this is not surprising, and this is something that was known prior to the Royal Commission being put together. This is why the Royal Commission was put together.
Sure.
What they've found, though, is that the abuse that's been reported is far higher than the extent of abuse that they expected.
Wow.
So this is a much more significant problem in the care sector than anyone coming into this inquiry had anticipated. The estimated 655,000 children, young people, and adults in care during the time period, so from 1950 till 1999, it's estimated that 200,000 were abused, and even more have suffered from neglect.
Wow.
So that's at least a third, and that's probably a fairly low-end estimate. It's likely that number is higher. So what that's showing is that there are these systemic problems that have been covered up, silenced, and ignored. It's a long period, and it's not as if this all happened at the beginning. This is happening all throughout that time period. And as I was saying, there are stories that they're hearing up until 2019. So this is still happening. And I think that helps to show that this is something that is deeply entrenched in this care system. There are cultural problems that are causing this abuse to proliferate. And I think that's something the Royal Commission does a really good job of explaining, those cultural problems. It's not just about telling survivor stories, but saying, well, why are these things happening? What's the water that we're swimming in that is allowing this abuse to go unnoticed or not listened to? It's also worth noting that Māori and Pasifika peoples were disproportionately impacted by this abuse, not only because there are higher rates of Māori and Pasifika peoples in state care, but also because they seem to have been more targeted by the abuse when they are in this care. And there's also significant stories and really important stories from disabled survivors that there's a lot to learn from.
Just wondering too, just as we're listening, would it be helpful maybe to give us a bit more understanding in defining what abuse is? And maybe is there a difference of abuse and care? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so I guess start with what abuse is and how the Commission's defined abuse. So the Commission's investigated a whole range of types of abuse, which is really helpful that all of these different types of abuse have been investigated and we can get a good understanding, partly of how they work together as well. Abuse is generally not just one type at a time. So they've investigated physical abuse, emotional abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, exploitation, neglect, and also they do touch on spiritual and cultural abuse. So it's, as I said, really wide-ranging, and they're quite intertwined. So generally, if you're looking through the Commission and their statistics on how many survivors experienced each type of abuse, there's a lot of overlap in those statistics. Now, when the Commission's talking about abuse in care, that question of in care is really important. What does care mean? So the primary focus of this commission is on institutional care settings. So these are things like children's homes, residential health facilities, orphanages, boarding schools, even foster care that is in people's homes. As I said earlier, most of these care settings were faith-based providers for state needs. So the state would have someone who was highlighted as needing type of care, and they would then pass them over to a faith-based provider who would provide that care. The faith-based focus of the inquiry does extend to pastoral care as well, but the main focus is those care settings I talked about, but there is an extension to pastoral care. I'll just read how they define this. So they say, in the care of faith-based institutions, this also includes pastoral care, although not everyone who is in a pastoral care relationship is automatically in care. A person with authority or power given by a faith-based institution could develop a trust-based relationship with a child, young person, or adult. If that trust-based relationship was related to the faith-based institution's work or was enabled by the authority or poser given by the institution, then this would be considered as being in the care of a faith-based institution. So that's quite wordy. Appreciate that. But I think it's important for understanding how this in care is being defined, because while the focus is on those institutional settings, there is some scope in the inquiry for investigating how people in our churches are being cared for and whether there is abuse happening within those care relationships. I don't think that they're saying, though, that they investigated every type of abuse that happened within a Christian church setting, but there is scope within the investigation for investigating abuse that happens within a church setting due to that pastoral care relationship. Does that make sense?
It does. And I mean, you've touched on, just in that definition there, the issue of power, right? Like, and which seems to be significant in any kind of abuse situation, right? That is, there's always going to be a power imbalance when someone is being abused by another person. So, and it was interesting to me reading in the reflections on faith-based institutions, the way they name the fact that there is a unique power dynamic within faith-based settings that led to abuse that isn't in existence in other settings. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think the unique nature of faith-based settings is really important to highlight. Part of this is the way that we treat leaders in faith-based settings. So it's not only pastors or priests or ministers who abuse people in faith-based settings. It's really important to acknowledge that lay people or just kind of everyday congregants can also be perpetrators. But often leaders are held in a particular esteem because of an expected relationship that they have with God. Or there's a particular type of trust that we have within faith-based settings because religious people are seen as being better than other people. They're seen as being safer, which actually means that breach of trust when abuse happens is even more significant because people were so much more trusted. There are stories in the report of whānau who are really happy that their young people are being cared for in faith-based settings because the expectation is they will be more safe, when in fact those breaches of trust are so much more significant because of those high expectations. And then I think that's partly where the spiritual abuse element comes in as well. If you have leaders who, in many ways, whether they like it or not, they're perceived as standing in the place of God. And then when they abuse that trust, whether it's by perpetrating the abuse themselves or not listening to stories of abuse that has been perpetrated by another, they're acting in the person of God saying, I don't believe you, or by perpetrating that abuse. And there's that spiritual element that then says, well, does God not care about the abuse? Yeah, what does God think about this?
You're really speaking to a very profound core idea of understanding our humanity, even as pastors. And Stephen and I were reflecting on this earlier, talking about, when I was training at Kerry College, one of the probably most formative ideas that I came away with was some of my conversations with the principal at the time, Brian Smith. And it was this idea that we're not immune. We're training to be pastors, but we're not immune from when we hear stories and we think, I would never do that. And his reply was, given the same circumstances and experiences, we are all capable of doing the things that we think we're horrified by. And that is incredibly humbling. But I think a good dose of that, then it just keeps that check, that we need accountability, no matter what our position is. And so as a pastor, that's really shaped me, that sort of core idea. And so it's like, wow, we seem to have not been able to hold those both, that we can have a calling, but we have this responsibility to understand our humanity, that we always have that. So, yeah, we seem to have lost this idea that we're not immune.
Yeah. I wonder, again, this is just the beginning of chapter 8. They list 3 unique factors for faith-based settings. I'll read them, and maybe we can talk a little bit about them and how we see these playing out or our experience with these. So the factors were A, the authority and impunity of religious institutions. B, certain discriminatory attitudes, policies, and practices that contributed to abuse and neglect. And then harmful use of beliefs and practices that created environments that fostered abuse and neglect. So yeah, so those are the 3 factors. Shall we talk a little bit about what those kind of mean and how we might see these playing out in our own contexts?
Yeah, something that's come up, and it does come up in this Royal Commission, and it's also been seen globally. So there's been a number of royal commissions into this type of abuse around the world. Each country has a slightly different focus, but there's really important things that we can learn from all of them. But something a lot of them have brought up is how faith-based settings are more likely to treat abuse as a moral issue rather than often a criminal one when it needs to be a criminal one. And we're quick to treat abuse as sin and to encourage people to seek forgiveness or restitution, reconciliation. But we're slow to think about justice. We're slow to think about the criminality of actions. We think that we can kind of mete out divine justice. But a lot of the time in the modern Western church, divine justice just means forgiveness. And I think we kind of lost something there on what justice means for God, that there are consequences, there are actions that need to be taken to make things right. And I think that's a huge part of the failure of the church's authority, that people look to the church to deal with these issues because they think, well, the church has all authority. So if a situation has happened within a faith-based setting, within a church setting, there's this expectation that the church is entirely appropriate to deal with that itself. And I actually think these failures to engage justly with abuse mean that we've proven ourselves to not be sufficient to deal with it ourselves.
Yeah.
And that we really do need to go wider. We need to acknowledge our failings and say, no, we're not enough.
Yeah. And the authority given to leaders, right? The kind of that word clericalism, where there's a difference between me because I'm a pastor and you because you go to the church that I go to, hypothetically. And so therefore I have more authority and therefore am able to use that in a way that in certain situations could be abusive or is abusive.
Yeah, I think clericalism in a Baptist setting is actually really insidious because Baptists think that we don't have a problem with clericalism. We don't have people wearing funny outfits or different hats, anything demarcating them from the laity, from the people in the congregation. And what this means actually is that we can't identify those that have power. We're really bad at being able to say, well, that person has a lot of power in this space. With Baptists, because of the nature of our leadership structures, yes, it might be obvious to point at the pastor and say, well, the pastor obviously has a type of clerical power. But there are other people in our communities who also hold that type of power, but they're not distinguished by any of those trappings of clericalism that other communities might have. So it can often be really difficult to be able to point out, well, actually, that person also has that type of infallibility that clerical leaders can often have. That person has the ability to abuse their power. And because we can't name that they have power, it's then very difficult to watch whether or not they're abusing the power that they have.
Right.
I think Baptist pastors need to understand some of this. They need to understand their own power, and they need to be able to say, yeah, I do have power. I talk to Baptist pastors who want to say, well, because of our ecclesiology, I don't really have any power. I love that idea. I'd love it if our ecclesiology meant that no one had any power and we were all equal. But there is a particular power that a pastor holds, and a lot of that is because of what we as congregants kind of invest them with. We have expectations about what pastors are going to do, that they're going to act rightly in a particular situation, or there's someone that we can trust, there's someone that we can go to for help. That's a type of power. It might not be, they don't have power necessarily to control people. So in some settings, they absolutely do. But it's the type of power that we invest these people with. And I think Baptist pastors need to start recognizing that we actually do have a clerical system. And when we see that language of clericalism, it can be really easy to say,
It's
well,
not
that's just these
us.
other types of churches.
Yeah.
It's us too.
Right.
Gosh, I actually hadn't thought about it in that way. That's really helpful to even recognize that we don't know how to even name that we have power, because you can't actually change something you're not even aware of.
Yeah, and it can be elders as well. It might not even be someone who's on your eldership. It might be someone who's maybe everyone in the church kind of knows that they give a bit more, and it's their finances that are propping up your whole church. So they might not be on eldership, they might not have any official position, but that's a whole lot of power. And if they were to do something abusive, how many people in the community are willing to stand against that?
But I think the reality is that not many people would, or it will be an incredibly difficult process to stand up against that, which just highlights the complexity of not being able to name power and where it is and point it out, all that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that you raised in that opening to chapter 8, Stephen, was the beliefs, beliefs that we have. And I think this is a really big one.
Okay.
So when I look at the church in Aotearoa, I see this within kind of all churches, and especially within different Baptist churches around the country. I think we do have a lot of these beliefs that are really problematic and create what I would call a culture of abuse, a culture where abuse is able to flourish because we don't notice it, or maybe there's a particular belief that actually contribute to abuse happening. So we talked about forgiveness and some of the dangers that our beliefs about forgiveness have. We talked about leadership, clericalism, the problems those have. Another really big one is sex and how we talk or don't talk about sex. And I think of my upbringing. It was in kind of a big non-denominational church, and it seemed, especially in my youth group, that we talked about sex a lot. But what we really talked about was how not to have sex, and there was very little information about safe sex, about consent. And I think those taboos are really dangerous. What they can mean is that survivors aren't able to name what has happened to them as abuse. They may be more easily swayed by a leader who says, no, this is an okay thing, or maybe they just don't know. At the same time, there's so much shame about sex in the church that can mean that people who experience sexual abuse feel that shame and are unwilling to come forward because they're worried that they're going to be treated as if they're broken.
Yeah.
As if there's something tarnished about them, because that's often how we talk about sex outside of marriage relationships, is that it's something that tarnishes you, something that makes you less valuable. And that language about sex has really significant carryovers to how people feel about abuse, that there can be that fear that the shameful act of sex, even though it wasn't something they wanted, still is going to tarnish them. This is something the report brings up. They talk about the taboos surrounding sex in faith-based settings and highlighting how there's a lack of education, there's a lack of knowledge of appropriate or inappropriate sexual behavior, and that this can really contribute to sexual abuse.
And I think the report even states that religious beliefs, whatever they might have been, often were used to justify the abuse as well.
Yeah, and some of that comes with that lack of education. And I appreciate we're talking specifically about sexual abuse here, but this can happen with other types of abuse. And as I was saying, they overlap and mesh with each other. So if you've got a religious leader saying to someone, this is what God wants, that's a type of spiritual abuse. So all these things kind of, they overlap and build on each other.
And when you're talking about the culture that we've created, I think part of it too is the lack of freedom that we feel to be able to question, to even know that we can question someone in authority
Mhm.
We don't have that. And so if you've got someone in such high regard and you can't question them, that culture stays embedded. We can't highlight that something isn't right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ties into as well, a lot of faith-based settings have a real lack of clarity about how complaints happen. And if you've got someone in authority who feel like you can't question, you actually need an avenue to complain that doesn't go to them.
Yes.
And feels safe, feels that there's someone who might listen to you. And because there are some times when maybe you've had an encounter with someone and you're just not sure. You think like, I didn't like that, but I don't know if that counts as abuse. I don't know if that was inappropriate. Maybe it's just me overreacting. I think people can really talk themselves down from complaining. But if you feel that there's someone who you can process that with, who you can come to and say, look, this happened, I don't know. And then that person can say to you, yeah, that's absolutely something that we need to escalate. That's not appropriate behavior. But we need those kind of safe avenues for complaining that allow people to question, that allow people to say, hey, I didn't like this. And they feel like that question's okay. And they also feel confident that someone, like I know for myself, it's feeling confident that someone will say, well, actually, I think you're overreacting if you are.
Right.
We actually need to be able to have both, be able to have those places where people can dialogue and think about those complaints. Because most of the time, you're not overreacting. Probably 99 times out of 100, it's real. If you think it's not okay, it's not okay. And that there needs to be a safe place to ask that question.
Yeah.
And can I just pick up just that word complaining? Can we just sit with that for a moment? Because I think we also have a lot of narrative around we're supposed to be building up. We're supposed to say all the good things. And so as soon as you say the word complain, it's almost like I'm doing something wrong.
Mm.
And so I just wanted just to highlight that we need to have maybe some other ways to understand that that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Does that?
In many ways, I prefer the word disclosure. I think
Okay.
disclosure is a really helpful word. I use the word complaints because that's what's kind of generally used.
Yeah.
But I think when we're talking about these issues of abuse, it's disclosure,
That's a good word.
that we're really talking about. And disclosure is quite challenging. Often we want to look at reports like the Royal Commission statistically and say, well, okay, what was the number of disclosures? But there are so many barriers to disclosure that it's actually really hard to look at this statistically. We cannot say with any confidence that every person who experiences a form of abuse in our churches discloses that abuse to anybody. There are some studies that suggest it could be as many as 9 out of 10 people do not disclose abuse that they've experienced. That's really troubling to me. And I think we need to be working incredibly hard on removing some of those barriers to disclosure. Like I talked about, having an avenue where people can ask a question, where people can say, was this okay? That's a way for allowing disclosure, for encouraging disclosure. And until we remove as many of those barriers as possible, we're actually not going to have any idea what the situation in our communities is.
Could you name a few more of the barriers? I think that might be really helpful for us to think about.
Yeah. So education's a huge barrier. People not knowing that what has happened is abuse. There's known to be quite a long time delay for disclosure. So it could be 20 years, 30 years, 40, even 40, 50 years that people wait until disclosing. Some of that is because people simply did not know that what happened was abuse. If you have a young child who is abused, they may not have the language to explain what happened. They might not be able to name it as abuse. So they're unlikely to come forward unless they're told that that was wrong. So often people will disclose a lot later because that's when they become aware that what has happened is wrong. People also wait a long time to disclose because they don't feel like it's safe to disclose.
Yeah.
They don't feel that they're going to be listened to. And this is where I think a lot of those cultural things come in. If we have a culture of victim blaming, a culture of shame, then people are really unlikely to come forward. I think of an example. The context I grew up in, and I'm sure a lot of people had similar experiences, was very, very harsh on what women wore and kind of continually telling women to cover up and to dress in particular ways. what that implicitly says is that if you're not dressing like that, you're at more risk. So if something does happen to you, you might then have that question of, oh, but I wasn't dressed right. So if I come forward, people might believe that it was partly my fault. They might not believe that I didn't want this. Or they might say I was in the wrong place. So it's my fault for being there. I should never have been alone with that person. So these shame barriers, I think, are really significant and are something that they're compounded by the way that we think about sex often in our church, but also the way we think about women.
Mm.
It's a really significant thing as well in terms of the way that we think about men. So again, just my research is largely in sexual abuse, so that's why I'm a bit more focused there. But for men, there are a couple of factors at play. The first one I want to talk about is the expectation that men want sex, which can make it really hard for survivors to disclose because they feel that if they say, I didn't want this thing to happen to them, people won't believe them because they'll say, but you're a guy. Of course you wanted that. Of course you wanted, like, that's a good thing. And so that can create a real barrier. And men aren't expected to be victims. Women are expected to be victims. So it can be really hard for men to come forward. Another thing is that we have a significant taboo around homosexuality, and more conservative Christian beliefs on homosexuality can make it incredibly challenging for male survivors to come forward if they've been abused by a male, because there is a fear that they are also going to be labeled as homosexual, which is perceived as being a negative, that they're then, even though they didn't want to participate in this act, that they're somehow going to be put into a category that is a negative, that is sinful, despite the fact that it wasn't something they wanted. So that can be a huge barrier to disclosure, shame around sexuality.
It's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned the males not being expected to complain or to disclose that, and just of the 841 survivors from faith-based care in the report, 61% were male, 38 were female, and then 1% were gender diverse or non-binary or other. So that's a really important thing to, and I also acknowledge that statistics, you've already said the statistics are probably a fraction, statistically a fraction of what actually has happened. So
yeah, and we know as well that men are more likely to have been in those care settings,
right,
so that contributes to that higher number.
Sure.
But it's really troubling. There are a lot of male survivors, and often when we're talking about particularly sexual abuse, we're able to talk about women quite easily. There's an expectation that women will be victims of abuse, but to talk about men as victims of abuse can be a bit more challenging. And I think that's a really important conversation for us to be having.
Yeah. And you've kind of touched on this, but the other point that the report lists was just discriminatory attitudes. And I know this kind of touches on some of our last conversation around your own research, but looking at the way that women are considered in church settings. And again, you've already named negative attitudes about sexuality, but then you've also named or touched on earlier the cultural side of things as well. And then, of course, the ableism aspects as well. So there are practices of discrimination that, again, this is something that the Commission has noticed as unique in faith-based settings. Not that they're saying this discrimination doesn't happen elsewhere, but there's something about our settings that discrimination has enabled this kind of abuse to happen. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I was really interested reading that. So there's a specific report for the Jehovah's Witness Church, and for Christians listening, they maybe want to say that there's a bit of distance there, but I actually think there's a lot of overlap with how Jehovah's Witness communities kind of are structured with how a lot of Christian communities are structured. And one thing they note is a real barrier for women disclosing within the Jehovah's Witness faith is that there are no female leaders. So women are not able to hold any position of leadership within Jehovah's Witnesses. And it's not to say that women can't disclose to men, but often that feeling of safety can be really challenging to find if you've had a male abuser and you want to disclose that abuse. The desire is often to go to a woman instead of to go to a man. And so by not having any women leaders, what the report identifies for the Jehovah's Witnesses is that women were less likely to disclose their abuse because there was nowhere that they felt safe doing that. While that is quite a different setting to a lot of Christian settings, I do think there's a lot we can learn from that, and how I think of in Baptist settings, there are not many women pastors. There are not many women in leadership. Even kind of looking at the wider leadership structures around the Baptist Union, there are a lot less women, and this can create barriers for women to disclose, even for men to disclose as well, this feeling of safety. And I think it's something that we need to be really seriously looking into, is how are we ensuring people can safely disclose? You mentioned as well there, Stephen, about disability, visible disability, people being able to see disability in leadership can be a really significant factor for people being able to disclose, because they feel that they might be listened to. If someone has a disability and the abuse is connected with that disability, seeing someone who might share some of their experience or might be understanding of their experience, again, they're more likely to disclose because they're more likely to feel that they'll be believed. And so I think those are things that we need to be looking into as well.
And it seems too that you're highlighting that, probably, I'm just imagining, a lot of our congregations might not even have processes. They might not have anything in place. So this is a huge gap, because, and you're also talking about that word belief. That seems to be coming through so much. You said at the very beginning that when they started the report, their first thing they wanted to do was to just listen and believe. And I just find that really powerful, that stance. There has to be some more conversations around what is our stance so that people can feel believed. There seems to be a huge barrier.
Yeah, I think what you raise about processes and complaints processes or disclosure processes is really important. For me, any process like that needs to be survivor-centric, because it's exactly what you're saying about belief. When we're putting the survivor at the heart of that, we're saying to them initially, yes, we believe you. Now, that doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be an investigation, an appropriate investigation. Of course there does, because we need to understand the full story of what happened. Abuse doesn't happen in a vacuum. Often there are other people who were aware, or there are systems that allowed for that abuse to happen, whether that's by providing opportunity or cultures and beliefs that mean that a survivor maybe didn't understand what was happening as abuse, or that the perpetrator felt that they had that power over someone else and could perpetrate that abuse. So a full process is always necessary, but we have to start with the survivor and with believing the survivor. This process, I think, above all, when we start with the survivor, we deal with a lot of the issues of disclosure, a lot of the issues of accessibility, because we're starting with that person and we're saying, okay, we want this person to be able to come to us. So we're going to have an easily accessible process. Something I would love to see churches doing is, if you have a process, which obviously have a process, but when you've got that process, have I don't know how tech savvy your church is, but have a QR code on the toilet doors. Have something around that people can engage with easily. If it's on a website, it's too hard. If it's somewhere that people have to go on a website and do a couple of clicks to get to the disclosure form, it's too hard. If there's someone that they're supposed to know to talk to, that's too hard. This needs to be accessible for a young person. Ideally for a young child, there needs to be a way that they can engage with it. And there might be age appropriate steps with that the process for primary school children might be a slightly different ways into it than for older people. But we need to be thinking about our teenagers. Our teenagers don't know who the chair of the elders is. So they're not going to be disclosing to the chair of the elders if that's what the process is. They need a link that they can quickly go to, or a form that they can easily fill in, that might go directly to the chair of the elders, but they don't have to have a personal conversation. And we need to think through, what does that mean for children? How do children access this? Disclosure needs to be the easiest thing. Then once you're in that process, it needs to be really clear. So when people disclose, they immediately need to know exactly what's going to happen, and they need to be supported through it. So it's not just a case of sending through a really long email that says this is everything they're going to do and very legalistic. Something I've been challenged by recently, one of our church members, is to say, we're at church. Yes, we need a good legal policy. It needs to be appropriate. But above all, we're a church. This needs to be people-centric, and this needs to be love-centric and full of those kingdom values that we believe in. So yes, it needs to be the appropriate legal framework, but it has to be centered in love and centered in caring for people. So that means being transparent. That means being independent. Your own church cannot investigate abuse that happens in your own community. There are too many power dynamics at play. There are too many opportunities for people to care for their own, whether they mean to or not. And this is, I want to come with the best intentions and say, I think people are trying. I don't think people do this with harmful intent most of the time. Some of the time they absolutely do. But we're human, and I think we love people, and we're at great risk of believing our friend and believing the best in our friend, even if there's good evidence that they've done harm. So these things have to be independent. They also need to be restorative. And I don't mean restorative for the perpetrator. That may be something that can happen, but that should not be our priority. When I say restorative, I mean restorative for the survivor. How are we thinking about redress? How are we thinking about their well-being? Yes, there is concern that needs to, and I think that comes out of our Christianness, there is concern that needs to be given for the perpetrator, but that is not our first priority. Our first priority is restoring the survivor. And obviously, and this goes without saying, the police need to be involved where the police need to be involved. But I will say that because that has not always been the case.
That's right. I think about my own church dynamic where, I'm a pastor. I have a really good working relationship and just human relationship with my elders. If they were to hear from someone that I had done something that was abusive, I can imagine, because of our relationship and how well we work together, their first thought would be, really, Stephen? He wouldn't have done that. And that's not to say that they're doing anything, they're trying to not believe, but there would, I imagine, or maybe even I hope, there's a sense of that they would be going, no, that's not Stephen. But actually, that's not what we need from our other people who are being disclosed to. Actually, assume the worst of me for the sake of that person, right? Now, as you said, I desperately need and hope a good process would follow that. But if I've done something that has been abusive or interpreted as abusive, how do we make sure that that person who's experienced that interaction is cared for, loved, and restored? I think that for me as a pastor, that has to be my priority. Otherwise, it's just, I'm in it for me, right? And that's not okay. And so, I think that's really the victim-centric or the survivor-centric approach has to be the way that we, I don't know if begin is the right way of putting it, but certainly go from here, from this point, from this kind of turning point of this report. Yeah.
Because it did make me think, as people are listening, and they might go, oh, I don't even know if there is a process. I mean, what we hope is that maybe this will spark like, okay, so I need to go find out. And if then they go and find out that there isn't anything, so Jaimee, is there some resources? Is there places that people can go? Because like even what you highlighted about you need another group outside the church that is helping you in this process because of our natural tendency to want to protect our own. The natural human. So, people might not have even thought about that as, oh, okay, of course, that's a really important accountability. So where do people go to start to build that kind of process?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Kathy. And I would encourage people to seek out resources. So there's stuff that will require more work from you. There's things like the Australian Royal Commission came out prior to our own, and there are really significant recommendations in that Commission and significant changes that the Australian Church has made off the back of that. So learning from Australian churches is actually, I think, an important step for us here in Aotearoa, that we can see what they've done. Their Royal Commission was even more focused on abuse that happened within churches. So there's a lot that we can learn from that. And great Australian academics have been doing work on that to help encourage churches and what they need to be changing. The other thing that we can do in Aotearoa is look to other denominations. Speaking just to Baptists here, other denominations are a bit further along the journey than us. They've made mistakes. Those mistakes are detailed in the Royal Commission, and we can learn from those mistakes. We don't have to make the same mistakes. We can learn from those mistakes and jump along the journey with them. We don't have to start from square one like they did. So let's read the Royal Commission and learn from those mistakes, but also have ecumenical conversations. If you're a pastor, have a conversation with the other pastors around you who might not be part of your denomination, and they might have other processes that you can learn from that have worked in their communities. There are also specialists in this who run workshops, and so encourage them to come in, teach your community, bring the whole community on for this, though. That's really important. Your leadership team can't be the only ones making these decisions. It's really important that our whole communities know what's happening and that our whole communities are a part of deciding what these processes are.
Jaimee, you run workshops like this, don't you?
Yes, I do. So people can get in touch if they want me to come in. We can do that, to kind of talk through some of the beliefs that might be shaping these problems, but then also look at policy, look at process, and think about what changes might need to be made for that specific community.
And the National Support Centre of the Baptist Union of New Zealand does have a complaints process on its website. We've talked a little bit about accessibility challenges, and that perhaps is one of them, but it is there. And I know the National Support Centre will take it very seriously as disclosures are made. One of the things, and this is very Baptist-centric now, that I noticed as I was reading the report is lots of other denominations were named quite specifically in the way they responded or didn't respond. We weren't. So can you talk a little bit about why that might have been? And so why, if we weren't named, what's the big deal for Baptists?
So I want to say first that Baptists are named. And that's really important. There are 16 survivors who told their stories and affiliated themselves with Baptist care settings. 16 is 16 too many.
True.
And we cannot overlook this. Also, want to reiterate again what I said statistically. That does not mean that there have only been 16 survivors of abuse from Baptist settings. It just means that only 16 talked to the commission. So 16 is 16 too many, but I also want to say the number is a lot higher than 16. It's just that only 16 participated in this commission.
Right.
That's really important to name first.
Yeah.
Second thing, so there are 8 faith-based care providers which are discussed in specific detail. So it's the Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Salvation Army are the big ones. Then the Commission also investigated Gloria Vale, the Plymouth Brethren, and Jehovah's Witness. In terms of survivor numbers, Baptists are next below those 8. So we a line had to be drawn somewhere. There was a limitation on the inquiry, and we're just outside of scope. So that's nothing to congratulate ourselves on. No. There is nothing to celebrate here. And actually, if we had been investigated, that would have been helpful. We'd have more information about our settings. So it's a shame that we weren't investigated, but there is absolutely nothing congratulatory about not being investigated. There's also part of why I think Baptists just slipped out of scope is because the focus of the inquiry means that Baptist settings, while they were included, are slightly more peripheral to the terms of reference. So as I've said, pastoral care settings were included in the inquiry, and that is the majority of Baptist settings. We have very few institutional care settings during this period. So we did have the Maniarewa Children's Home, but that just didn't have a significant part to play in the care environment in the same way that those 5, the Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Salvation Army did. So there was just, I think, we're just slightly outside of that scope because it was focused on institutional care. Pastoral care was included, but a very minor part of the focus. What the inquiry themselves say is they could not investigate all faiths practicing in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to the same extent. This does not mean that we are any better, any safer than anyone else. It just means we had less care settings, so there was less for them to investigate within the particular terms of reference that they were talking about.
Right.
As we're coming to the end of our time, what do you think the consequences are if we don't make changes that this report has recommended?
I think basically if we don't change based on these recommendations, nothing changes for survivors, nothing changes for our people. And if we take that number of 16, appreciating that that is not the true number, there will be 16 more in 50 years' time. That number will just keep rising. If we do not change now, nothing will change for our people. So this is priority number one. I know that pastors care about their people. I have no doubt about that. And if you care about your people truly, this is what you will be concerned about, because this is an indictment on our care of our people. This is saying there are people being harmed in our communities and we have done nothing. And right now we have a choice. We have a choice to keep doing nothing, or we have a choice to change. And I really hope that that care for our people comes out and we do.